Welcome to the Key of Imagination. This week we're going to be looking at the Twilight Zone episode, Nightmare as a Child. We'll talk about why Helen appears to herself as a child. We'll dive into why the repetition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is an important part of this episode. And I'll reveal why my moment of awe involves the vastness of the human mind. So, grab your keys and let's open up this door to the fifth dimension.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination.
Helen Foley is returning from a typical day of work as a teacher. When she arrives at her apartment door, she's greeted by a lovely but solemn-looking child. When Helen invites little Markie, her young guest, into her home, things quickly start to become odd. Markie continually claims to know everything about Helen, and what's even more odd is that she's correct. But a knock on the door by a man named Peter Selden chases away our little friend. You see, Peter noticed that Helen gave him an odd look through his car windshield as she was walking home, and he just wanted to see if maybe Helen recognized him. Why? Because Peter knew Helen's mother, right up until the moment she was violently and tragically killed by an unknown assailant. All of this is rather overwhelming for Helen, as you can imagine. After all, she witnessed the violent attack on that day, and since then, she's been living as a kind of ghost, moving through her life, but never really being able to put much of her past together. That is, until today. It turns out that Peter Selden was the very man who killed Helen's mother, and when he tries to do the same to Helen, he is fortunately thrown down a flight of stairs. Markie, or rather Helen in her child form, has been attempting to help her remember in preparation for her meeting with the man of her nightmares. Nightmare as a Child is directed by Alvin Ganzer. The teleplay is by Rod Serling. As for our cast, we have the lovely Janice Rule as Helen Foley, Terry Burnham as Markie, and Shepard Strudwick as the dastardly Peter Selden. The episode first aired on April 29th, 1960. Now, one of the tidbits from this episode that has to be mentioned, and one that I already knew going into writing this episode, is that Helen Foley is the name of one of Rod Serling's favorite teachers from his primary school days. However, it's even a bit deeper than that. Helen Foley, the real one that knew Serling, is the person who started the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation, a wonderful organization that's doing everything that it can to keep the memory of this fantastic writer in the minds of the public. You might recall that I went to Serling Fest back in September. Well, the foundation is the one that puts on that event, and I had a fantastic time. I would definitely recommend going to rodserling.com and checking them out. And if it so moves you, sign up to be a donor. And just to be clear, yes, I'm a donor myself. I even purchased one of the bricks that's going to be installed around the still freshly unveiled Rod Serling statue in Recreation Park in Binghamton, New York. Hopefully by next year's Serling Fest, I'll be able to see it for myself. Now, all that to say, the really important part, you certainly don't have to be a teacher to make a difference in the lives of young people. But you do need to be someone with some patience, someone who believes in guidance, instruction, and knowing when to apply a little kudos and a little tough love. As for my initial thoughts, I like this episode. It's one of the ones that I remember from when I was a kid. The only negative thing that stood out to me on my initial reaction watch is the dissolve away that takes place between when Peter shows Helen the photo of herself as a child and when Helen wakes up on the couch. I think you have to show the audience how she handled getting out of that situation, because the director, Alvin Ganzer, does a wonderful job on this episode. But he builds up the intensity in that scene so high at that point that there's no gradual release there, just this dissolve. But the audience is left wondering, well, wait a second, what happened after that? What came next? The last thing I'll say here is that this episode feels a lot like an Alfred Hitchcock Presents. What I mean by that is the cinematography, the pacing, and that kind of alternating between total silence and sounds that are competing with each other for our attention. You know, Markie singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star while Selden is trying to get Helen's attention. That's an example of what I mean. I thought for sure that I was going to find that Alvin Ganzer had done an Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode. But I was wrong. I couldn't find it. Now, I do have one kind of criticism, real criticism, that I'll talk about in my rating section, which connects with this a bit and does impact my rating. Question 1. Why does Markie appear as a child? This was the immediate question that popped into my head when I watched this, and I do think that there are some surface-level answers and conclusions that we can certainly draw on our own. But something that really drew me into wanting to look a little deeper into this is Helen keeps calling Markie solemn and wise. And of course, she is quite solemn and turns out to be pretty wise. But why? Why not have a double of Helen show up and tell herself all about Peter, or at least an older version of herself, an adult? Why a solemn child? A kid who is still, by the way, very much afraid herself. I think most people have probably heard the phrase one's inner child before. In pop cultural references, it usually refers to the idea that there are times when an adult should emulate the exuberant joy that emanates from children when they get to act silly or indulge themselves in something new. And to be fair, that was pretty much what I thought about it as well. But then I also remembered that psychoanalyst C.G. Jung chose the child as one of his archetypes. We'll come back to how Jung fits into this toward the end of this section. Let's establish a connection with the episode first. When we're introduced to Markie and she enters Helen's home for the first time, she's very aggressive about asking questions. Of course, this mirrors a kind of therapy session where Markie is acting like a little therapist, desperately attempting to make her patient, Helen, come to the conclusions on her own. And there are good reasons for why people like therapists, teachers, and just about all parents utilize this approach. There's power in someone owning their epiphanies or their discovery of knowledge. You can dump information into a person's head, and that's what Markie does at the very end, which, again, we'll talk about that later. But if the person can see the information and discover it on their own, it becomes much more embedded in their conscious state of being. They can actively pull from this new knowledge when an event or moment necessitates. So Markie's peppering of questions is a way to get Helen to draw out the information and own it. That's understandable when we consider the position that Helen is in, the danger. Okay, let's connect this back to this idea of the inner child. As I was researching inner child work in psychological practices, I came across a fascinating article by Quinn Pearson. In the article, he states, inner child work seems to be a logical approach with female adult survivors who were injured as children. Now, Pearson doesn't go into much detail about why this is the case, but I was not aware that there's a gendered aspect to the inner child that makes it more palatable and effective to women who have experienced a traumatic event as a child. I'm no psychiatrist, and I don't even play one on TV. Yeah, I went there. That's a joke for some of us who are a little bit older. Yeah, let's move on. However, here's what I find interesting about Markie. Because she presses Helen to reclaim her memories, Helen has to own them. She can't simply let Markie have them and, just kind of walk around with them herself because they do her younger self no good. Then consider this. When Markie begins to yell at Helen toward the end and quite literally confront her in a rather aggressive way, I think this serves an important purpose. She corners Helen in the chair and reintroduces an important character trait for not just Helen, but for all of us to remember, a trait that was removed from Helen when she experienced her traumatic event. The need to be combative and/or confrontational at times. Yes, there are times when we need to fight, to push back against people who seek to do us harm. Helen appears from the very beginning of this episode to be very deliberate in her mannerisms. She attempts to keep herself in control always. And when she finally does lose her temper a bit, she immediately composes herself. In being combative and confrontational, Markie is actually prepping Helen to fight against Peter Selden. With her memory of the event intact now, she knows what Peter's ultimate plan is. Now, would she have fought back so vigorously without Markie reintroducing these concepts of the importance of confrontation and combativeness? Maybe, but maybe not. So why does Helen show up as a child then to herself? I mentioned Jung earlier and how the child is a kind of archetype. Listen to what Jung has to say about this particular archetype. The child motif represents not only something that existed in the distant past, but also something that exists now. That is to say, it is not just a vestige, but a system functioning in the present whose purpose is to compensate or correct, in a meaningful manner, the inevitable one-sidedness and extravagance of the conscious mind. I'm fascinated by this idea of correcting. Traumatic events can sometimes overshadow all moments of our past, even the good ones. So by having Markie here, Helen reestablishes access to not just the one traumatic memory, but any of the good memories that she might have accumulated along the way from when she was a child to where she is now as an adult and moving forward. And so, Markie becomes a new kind of reference point. Whereas for much of Helen's adult life, Markie was a kind of point for where the fullness of her life stopped. She can now take her rightful place as simply a point of memory in the flow of Helen's personal timeline. To be clear, and this is important, I'm not saying that Helen is cured or that trauma is so easily whisked away. Serling himself dealt with the trauma of his war service in the Pacific for his entire life. What I'm saying is that there is hope for people to be able to resituate their reference points of memory into a more manageable context of the fullness of one's life, including all of the good memories that we might accumulate as well. If you're struggling with something that is keeping you from reclaiming your place as the hero of your life story, I encourage you to seek professional help and to get the weapons that you need to kill your dragons. Your inner child will thank you. But hopefully not literally by showing up to your apartment or house. Well, then again, it seems to have worked out for Helen, so who am I to say how you find your pathway to a better you? Question 2. Why does Markie sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? All right, you might be thinking, this is an odd question, Joe. Markie's a child. It's a childish song. That's all there is to it. Well, no, not so fast. I think there is more to say on this matter. We're going to break this section up into 2 parts essentially. Part 1 is where we'll talk about the sound of the song itself, and in part 2 we'll talk a little bit about the repetitiveness of the lyrics, in a sense. There's a reason why we begin teaching children songs like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It's quite simple in terms of the tonality of it, in the relationship between the notes themselves. The entire song is essentially encapsulated within a small amount of space on a piano, and the notes are so repetitive that it's a great first song to learn for any instrument, including one's voice. And it's in the repetition of it that we find the beauty of its use here. I want to explain a little bit how I came up with this part of the question, because I believe it's going to help us. I think I've mentioned before that one of my areas of research is hero studies, and of course that extends itself to modern superheroes as well. And of course, like most people, I do love me some Batman, particularly the Kevin Conroy-voiced golden era of Batman the Animated Series and the Justice League Animated Series. Well, there's an episode of the Justice League where the villain is a kind of psychic. He's able to break into people's minds and see their worst fears. But he can't break Batman. Why? As Batman starts to get closer and closer to the enemy, he begins to mindlessly, and I use this word here very specifically, Batman mindlessly continues to sing Frère Jacques over and over again in his head. This keeps his mind occupied on something so that the villain can't break into it to take control. But of course, Frère Jacques is a song that's very similar to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, in that it's incredibly simple, and it has a kind of repetitiveness to it that allows someone to start a whole new verse of it as soon as the last one finishes. Do you know where I'm going with this already? All right, let's get to our Twilight Zone episode. I think Markie is doing what Batman did. She's filling up Helen's mind, distracting her from Selden's push to see if she knows anything about him. In doing so, Markie is able to keep Helen from possibly figuring it out right there in the moment, in a time when she either wasn't prepared to know it or was in potentially grave danger. Helen's continued confusion at why Selden can't hear it is probably what allows her to escape that specific situation and avoid being murdered right there. Although, to be fair, I still think we need some kind of deus ex machina at that point and at other points. Again, I'll get to that later. When you think about this, it's not all that crazy. People count sheep at night, or they meditate, or pray. We do this sometimes to occupy our minds if they're either running chaotically rampant, or because we can't seem to get a specific thought, particularly a negative thought, out of our heads. If you have a persistently negative thought about yourself that just won't go away, give it a try. I mean the meditation, or the prayer. Well, I suppose you could just sing a childish song. This is the song that doesn't end. Yes, it goes on and on, my friend. Some people started singing it not knowing what it was, and they'll continue singing it because there aren't enough adults in the room to tell them to knock it off. And that's how the song that never ends comes to an end. At least that's how it was in my house. Question 3. What are your moments of awe? My moment of awe comes from recognizing just how interesting the human mind is. That we have these mechanisms for self-preservation, things like repression. It's truly amazing when you actually stop and think about it. But it also made me think about how technology will inevitably, and I guess it already is, become more intertwined with our psychology. Something that I talk with my students about is whether or not they would be okay with having their consciousness downloaded so that it could be used in the future for various things. Now, some of you might be surprised to learn that this current generation of young adults is actually pretty overwhelmingly against it. In fact, what they seem to struggle with the most is the question of how to classify what is real. However, the one concession that they usually make is for technologies like virtual reality and even embedded technologies in the brain itself in the future, how they might be able to be quite useful for helping those who are struggling with major mental health problems. Could I see a future where someone might actually be able to talk to a virtual form of their childlike selves for psychological purposes? Yeah, I think so. Now, whether or not that should happen is beyond my capabilities to answer. But if it hasn't happened already, it likely will. Just for the record, I have no interest in talking to my 7-year-old self. And my 7-year-old self would probably have no interest in talking to me. We would likely just kind of stare at each other, and then one of us would say, "Hey, you want to get some pizza?" All right. That's just the truth. As for my rating, I'm a bit torn on this one. I like the story a lot. I like the acting a lot. But I do think that there is some room to argue that this doesn't really feel like a Twilight Zone episode. Let me explain. At the end of the episode, Helen wakes up to hearing the little girl singing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." But when she goes out into the hallway, it's a completely different girl. Had it still been Markie, the younger version of herself, I think this feels more like a Twilight Zone episode. As in, Markie is not simply a figment of her imagination, but there's something about her that is really there, that she exists. This also connects with the hot cocoa scene as well. It would have been really interesting if Markie were actually drinking the cocoa, so that we had this sense that she could be physically there. As it stands by the end, this episode does not really land as a true Twilight Zone feeling episode for me. But it's good enough in terms of its production that it still lands in a very respectable middle tier rating for me. Next time, we'll be taking a look at A Stop at Willoughby, and here are your questions to consider when watching the episode. Question 1. Does the initial business meeting scene reveal more about Garth's state of mind than we might have previously considered? Question 2. What role do the conductors play in this episode? And question 3. What are your moments of awe? Now, I've said a couple of times that this episode feels like an Alfred Hitchcock episode. And honestly, that's quite a compliment, to be honest with you. I really love Alfred Hitchcock Presents. In fact, I know for some of you who are maybe younger out there, or some of you who never really taken the time to watch Alfred Hitchcock Presents, there are some fantastic episodes of that show. I highly recommend if you have not seen any of them, or if it's been a long time, like me, for example. I did another wash through of Alfred Hitchcock about 3 or 4 years ago. If it's been a while or you've never seen them and you like this episode, give it a watch. I've got a few comments and shout-outs from the YouTube channel. On my execution episode, Sverg had the following far too kind of a comment. They write, "It's a crime that this channel isn't much bigger. I thank the almighty new algorithm of Lord YouTube for introducing me to your work and other growing channels lately. I hope this takes off. I want more. Great takes on so many great episodes of one of my favorite shows. Thank you for this and keep up the good work." Sverg, first, thank you so much for the kind words. I never forget that those of you out there who continue to comment with these kind thoughts and motivating comments and criticisms, that you don't have to do them, but you take time out of your life to just drop these down for me. And I want you to know, anytime that I put thank you, or anytime I put I appreciate you taking the time, I genuinely mean it. Also from the execution episode, Dennis Semps offered the following connection. When discussing whether Caswell has been to hell in the split second between his neck almost snapping and him traveling in time, I couldn't help but think about the C.S. Lewis book, The Great Divorce. The story follows a group of people boarding a bus from Greytown, many readers believe to be hell, or at least purgatory, to just on the outskirts of heaven. The story follows these people as they decide whether to go back to Greytown or to heaven. Most of them choose to go back to Greytown for various reasons. One person who has killed someone is confronted by their victim, who begs them to pick love, but the person ultimately decides to get back on the bus and go to Greytown. It's been a while since I've read the book, but it does tackle some interesting concepts about redemption, mercy, and second chances. I suppose it is the same point about Jacob's Ladder, but this time with a bus. Dennis Semps, that's a fantastic connection. And anytime someone recommends reading C.S. Lewis, that's a good recommendation to me. So I'm happy to throw this out into the void to see who will catch it. Thanks for taking the time to leave a thoughtful comment. You can continue our conversations by heading over to our Discord server and either starting a conversation about this episode or taking part in one that is already happening. The link to join the server should be in the episode notes section. You can also head over to thekeyofImagination.com, where you can rate this episode, learn more about me, watch previous episodes of the show, and check out my Curios page, where I showcase some of the Twilight Zone trinkets I've bought over the years. I encourage people to email me thoughts and comments, whether it's about a particular Twilight Zone episode, your rating for an episode, or about the Key of Imagination show. You can get those to me as a text, email, an audio clip, or even a video clip of roughly no more than 5 minutes to keyofImaginationshow@gmail.com. Keep in mind, even though we talk about some serious topics, we're trying to maintain as family-friendly of an atmosphere as we can. If you would rather I not use your comments on the show, please indicate that so I can respect your decision. If you enjoyed the show, I ask that you please take a moment and do one of the following to help build our community. Rate the show, review the podcast, leave comments, thumbs up, all of the usual algorithmic gymnastics that will help get the show in front of more people and help us build our community of Twilight Zone fans. However, even if you do none of that, and you absolutely hated every minute of this, I'm still going to thank you for spending some time with me. Until next time, remember, all doors are open to those who possess the key of imagination.